I got to thinking about that essay that you usually have to write when you get back from summer vacation, right? Especially when you're in middle school, maybe late elementary, and then the teacher has you write that essay. What did you do on your summer vacation? And so being gone for 3 months on this sabbatical and then coming back today, I thought, boy, I could write that whole essay and tell you everything that I did. And as much as I would love to do that, there's just not time to do all of that right now. But what I do want to do is reflect with you a little bit on some of the things that I learned, some of the things that I was reflecting on and thinking about and trying to apply in new ways in my own life. And I wanted to share that with you. But before I do that, I really feel I need to express our gratitude to you as a church for giving this time away. You got behind the idea early on as a church, and you stood by that idea of investing in myself and my family as pastoral leadership. You saw the importance of that. And it was such a terrific summer in so many ways. And we're coming back and we're feeling so refreshed and so encouraged and charged up for ministry. And we're very grateful to you as a church for investing in that for us. So we need to express that to you. But then I also want to tell you some things about rest and reflect with you on some of these ideas of rest. And to do that, I wanted to just kind of get at really 3 questions, I suppose, 3 ways that we can look at these 2 passages about rest. And what do they mean for us? I want to look at what does it mean to rest? What does it mean actually when the Bible talks about rest? What does that mean for us? Why do we need it? Why do we need to rest? Why does God tell us that we need to rest and build that rhythm of rest into our own lives? And then how can we do it? So why do we need, or what is rest? Why do we need it? How can we do it? And I want to look at that this morning. Now, the first thing I think we need to look at when we think about rest is sometimes we jump too quickly to the resting part. But this summer, and I actually spent a lot of time looking at that and studying that this summer, but I also spent a lot of time looking at the importance of work. And the place that our work plays in our own daily life and the way that work has an impact on our own culture. And so I'm going to put up some, just so you can see proof of this, I'm going to put up a picture here, a slide. What I did is I actually went to work with different people. I went to work on the top left there. My brother is a pilot, and he showed me his airplane. He wouldn't let me fly it. I tried, I begged, but no such luck. But he talked to me about the importance of his work as a pilot and how it's not just getting people from point A to point B, but it's about investing in their safety and creating a culture of safety at the airline that he works for. I went to the top right. Is not a very good picture. That's not me, but that's my cousin's husband. His name is Mike Bolt, and he's a children's author and children's illustrator. And so, and he writes these fantastic award-winning books. He's very modest about it, but he's been a very successful children's author illustrator. And he talked to me about the importance of story, and how even at a very young age, story plays such a key role in shaping the hearts and minds of different people, and how story is such an important concept in our culture today. And then I didn't get a picture of this, but I went to work with a police officer. I went on a ride-along, and we looked at the importance of justice, and how do we seek justice in our communities today. And then the picture on the bottom center is a picture of me cleaning. I was raised in a home where we actually did a lot of cleaning, but I actually got trained in how to do it properly and how to really do it well when I went to work with a cleaning company. And we talked about how cleaning is really not just about the cleaning, but it's about serving your neighbor, and it's about showing love to people by serving them. So all of this, I was looking at these themes of work and the impact that it has and the place that it plays in our world. And if you look at our text this morning, if you look at the 2 passages, Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5, you'll notice that God actually begins, or he affirms the importance of our work, doesn't he? He says in both of these texts, he says, 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. Now that's important, and I think maybe we jump too quickly over it. See, we are made, you and I are created for work. We're created with a purpose. We're not meant to sit around and do nothing. We're not meant to be lazy. We're meant to be active and working. And that makes sense because if you even go back earlier, you go back to Genesis in Genesis chapter 2, God puts Adam and Eve in this garden, and what does he do? He puts them to work. He says, I want you to take the raw material of this world, and I want you to develop it, and I want you to cultivate it, and I want you to draw out the potential of this world. Now, I want to be really clear, because when you talk about work, sometimes right away we think, well, does that mean you have to do work to get a paycheck? Right? What about people who are elderly and can't work anymore at a job? Or you're too young, right? You're early middle school or whatever. Well, work is bigger than just what we do to earn a paycheck. Work is the way that we use our talents and our abilities and the skills that God has given us in the place that he has put us. So whether you're full-time or part-time, whether you're a volunteer in the community, whether you're a student and God has put you in that place to learn, that's your calling for the moment, or whether you're an elderly person. We have a member of our church, up until just a couple of years ago, even into her mid-90s, she was crocheting these little hats to give to the babies at the local hospital. Right? That's finding your purpose. And God affirms that. He says there's importance to that. There's value in that. We're called to do that. We're made to do that. Right? Before God sanctifies our rest, he sanctifies our labor. But then God says, after the work is done, you need to stop. And you need to rest. Right? The fourth commandment is about learning to rest. Now, I think it's good at this point to just take a step back and think for a moment about the purpose of God's commands. Because again, when we hear words like command or law, or sometimes the Bible uses the word statute, we think right away restrictive. God just wants to restrain our fun. Right? We have this idea that law is oppressive. The question is this: when God gives a command, do we trust his word? Do we trust that God is giving us commands for our good and so that we might flourish? The psalmist says that, right? The psalmist says, your law is a delight to me. In your law is life. And do we trust that? Now, I bring this out because I think this is particularly important when it comes to the fourth commandment. And let me explain what I mean. You read through the 10 commandments, and there are some commands there that are more obvious than others. God says, do not murder. And we read that and we say, well, that makes sense. We don't do well, and communities don't do well when people are allowed to murder each other. So we trust God on that one. Do not steal. Well, that actually makes a lot of sense to us too. We can see how a community would crumble when there's corruption and theft going on. So we say, yeah, that's good. We appreciate God's law on that one. Don't lie. Don't bear false testimony. Well, we're living in a time where false information spreads very quickly, and we've actually seen how destructive false information, fake news, can actually be. So maybe now we trust God on that. But now God comes along and says, I want you to rest. 6 days, work, but build in time of rest. And here's where I think we might be inclined to say, well, you don't understand, God. I'm pretty busy. I've got a lot of demands on my time. I've got a lot of people who need my attention. I've got a lot to do. And so I think instinctively we push back against this and we say, I'm not so sure I can really take that time to rest. So the question going in is, are we willing to trust God at his word here? And if we do, what does that actually look like? Well, here's where I think we find two things. There's really a lot we could pull out of this, but I want to direct your attention to two things, what it means to actually rest. The first is that rest is intentional. Rest is intentional. Look at the words that God uses here. Remember the Sabbath day. Observe the Sabbath day. Keep the Sabbath day. Guard the Sabbath day. Sanctify the Sabbath day. These are intentional words. They're words of action. That requires something we have to do. In other words, building in this rhythm of rest and observing the Sabbath as God would have us is not going to happen by accident. You're not going to just sort of drift into it. You're not going to just drift into rhythms of rest. To put it a little bit differently, if we haven't really thought through how am I being intentional about honoring God's word here, there's a good chance we aren't living as God intends in this area of our life. I realize that's a strong statement, but let's reflect on that a little bit. We have to be intentional, especially in a busy, fast-paced world with so many deadlines and so many demands and so many time crunches on us. We have to be intentional about thinking through, what am I doing to carve out this time of rest? So it's intentional, but it's also, what does it mean? It also means that we stop. Sounds simple enough, but let's see if we can dig a little deeper. The word Sabbath is from the Hebrew word Shabbat, and it simply means, at the most basic level, it means that we stop. It just means stop, cease working. And actually, that's what rest really is, isn't it? Rest means that we take out this period of our week. Often we do it on Sunday, but not everyone. My dad was a firefighter. I'm kind of glad he went to work Sundays. So were the people in the burning houses and buildings, right? It's a good thing. We can't all do it on the same day, but in general, Christians observe rest on Sundays. And what we are meant to do is to stop the routine of our life, to stop the busyness. Now, that's not going to look the same for everyone. Because actually, for some of us, what we do what we do on a Sunday is going to look like rest for some of us, and it's going to look like labor for another. Maybe the sort of person that loves to work in the garden. You just love to get your hands dirty and pulling weeds and fertilizing and all that other stuff. You love doing that. It restores you. It energizes you. And then for others of you, that is the worst possible work you could be doing. See, it looks a little different, but the point is that you are stopping the routine. You're being intentional about putting a fence around time in your life, time each week. You're putting up a barrier there, and you're saying, I'm not going to let the busyness of the rest of my week encroach upon that time, and I'm instead going to do something that will restore me and energize me and refresh me. Right? Now let's get a little more specific. Why do we need to rest? Why do we need to do it? Here's where it's interesting. Again, I'm not going to try to call on the kids because it might get a little chaotic, but you put these two commands side by side and you notice there's a few little differences here and there, but there's one major difference between these two commandments. Right? God gives the commands in Exodus 20, He gives them again in Deuteronomy 5. Most of the other 10 commandments are pretty well the same word, almost word for word in both readings of the commands, but in this commandment, there's a major difference. Not contradictory, not one is true and the other is not. It just means there's two different reasons, two different rationales given why God wants us to observe rest. The first is given in Exodus chapter 20. Look at verse 11. Exodus 20, verse 11. In 6 days, the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, but He rested on the seventh day. In other words, one of the reasons that we rest is that it helps us look back at creation. It helps us look back at God who sets the pattern of rest for us. Right? God is the one who, after a time of creating and working, He paused. Now, I don't know if you're like me, but I read that and I think, wait a minute, that doesn't make sense. God stopped working? God rested? Does that mean that He kind of let the universe run itself for a day and then got back to it on Monday morning? No. Does it mean that God said, wow, this is, bringing the universe into existence out of nothing? That's really tiring work. I need a day off, day to myself, right? Personal day or something? No, we know it's not that, right? But then what does it mean? What does it mean that God rested? I think there are two parts to that answer. I think the first part is that God He's showing us and He's sanctifying rest. He's saying it's good for you to stop what you're normally doing. It's good for you to stop there's a time for you to work, there's a time for you to be busy and productive, and then there's a time for you to stop. And then related to that, God is setting a pattern. He's saying, if I can rest, then you can too. it's a little bit like, if you're a parent, you've been down this road before. I'm going to tell you a little story. I'm going to really try hard not to identify which kid it was. Try really hard. This was when we were trying to get them into big kid beds, right? And if you're a parent, you know that doesn't always go so well. And in this case, it wasn't going very well. We'd put this child in bed, tuck them in. 3 minutes later, they'd be out of the bed. Go back, tuck them in. 3 minutes later, and it went on like that. We were getting kind of tired. So I set up a little tray table, put my computer chair right outside their door. And then that way, when I saw the door handle turning, then I could just quick pull it shut. Don't judge me. That didn't work either. So it was my wife that finally got into bed with this child and kind of lay next to them. I said, okay, I'm going to rest here with you. Setting the pattern of rest. And that worked. This child was unable to go to sleep. Now, my wife had to sleep the whole night in that bed then, but at least it worked, right? It was showing a pattern. And what God is doing in this command is He's saying, I'm going to show you what rest is, because you need it. And I'm going to show you how to do it. Right? Rest looks back at creation. It remembers that we can rest. We were created for work, but we're created to rest too. But then the second part of it. You look at the second. Or let's look at for a minute how to apply this. I guess I thought maybe be a little more specific here. What does this actually look like for you if you can actually live this out? I'm going to suggest that you set aside that time, you put that fence around this time in your week, and then you find a way to do something that restores you. And just personally, just by way of example, I've always had Friday as my day of rest, right? Sundays, it's a little hard for pastors to rest on Sundays. It's kind of a busy day. And so I've always had to pick another day, and Friday has always been that day. And generally, I've been pretty good at, I don't do work, I don't send emails and that kind of thing on Friday. But what I found happening is over the summer, I was kind of reflecting back, and I began to realize that what Friday had become was just a day to get other work done. Like I'd pay the bills, or I'd go to Winco and do the groceries and catch up on little household projects. And pretty soon I found that just wasn't restful. It was sort of like I just drifted into that and didn't even pay attention that it was happening. And so what I decided to do, I do it a little differently now. This past Friday, 2 days ago, I just went downtown, browsed the bookstore, went to a little Italian kitchen store, did some cooking at home. Some of you, that sounds like work, but it was good for me. I loved doing it. And I found it to be incredibly restorative. That's going to look different for you, but the point is the same. You're going to find time in your week, Sunday, perhaps it's another day, but Sunday I think certainly is a part of it, and you're going to build that time of rest into it. You're going to do something that restores you. Now let's look at the second part. What's the other reason that we rest? Well, now is where you got to turn to Deuteronomy 5 for a minute. In Deuteronomy chapter 5, verse 13. Verse 15. This is what God says. Why do you rest? Remember that you were slaves. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and that the Lord brought you out of there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. What's the point? We rest not just because we remember creation. We rest because we remember our redemption. You know what happened as I was studying this passage, I had never noticed this before, and it's a little technical, but bear with me here. In verse 13 of Deuteronomy 5, it says, 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. There's a Hebrew word there for work. I won't tell you what it is because I barely remember it right now myself. But here's the point. Here's what matters. If you go down to verse 15, it says, remember that you were slaves. That word slavery, guess what? It's the same Hebrew word as work. Now think that through for a minute. Here's the implications of that. Work, which is good, sanctioned by God, ordained by God, it's part of our purpose. Work can easily become slavery, can become oppressive. One of the worst parts, the worst angles, if you will, on the whole Israelite slavery in Egypt was that something that was meant by God for good was twisted and perverted into something oppressive. The Israelites were working, which itself is a good thing, but they were working under masters, people who they would whip them and beat them if they didn't do enough. The work became slavery. Do you not see how easily that happens to us today? Do you see how quickly work can become slavery? I mean, just think for your job for a minute. You probably don't have someone with a whip behind you. Hopefully not. Time to get a new line of work if you do. But really, the demands of your work, the pressure that you put on yourselves to get the promotion, to get ahead, can be relentless. And pretty soon something good like a job, like a career, can become slavery. Think about it. Maybe you're not quite at that stage in life yet. You're in sports. Sports is a good thing. You're using your gifts that God has given you. You're using that to His glory. But it can become relentless. It can become so central in your life that nothing else matters but making the team, staying on the team and winning, so that everything else gets pushed off to the side. Then your work, your calling, has become a taskmaster, a slave driver. You could go on down the list. Academics, parenting, even serving in the community. All these good things can so quickly become enslaving. They can enslave us. They become our masters. And what God is saying here is that I've set you free from all of that. When God says to the Israelites, I set you free from the Egyptians, it doesn't just mean God said, I brought you out of Egypt and then you're on your own. No, He says, I set you free from the Egyptians who were your slave drivers so that you could serve me. I redeemed you to be my people. I'm your master. That's the same thing for us. You see, one of the reasons that we take a day of rest is that we come together to worship. What we're doing here, when we get together in this place, it's about remembering that we serve Jesus. He's our master. You go out there Monday through Saturday and you hear all kinds of other voices of things. You ought to listen. You ought to listen to these voices and serve these things and be enslaved to these things. But we come here and we say, no, Jesus is our master. He has set us free from the power of sin. He has set us free from all those other masters so that we might worship and serve Him alone. Sabbath is about remembering that. Rest is about remembering that we are free from that. Now, I know you've probably heard this before. Right? You probably know this on some level. But then why do we find it so hard to rest? Why do we find it so hard to stop what we're doing, even for 24 hours? Why do we find it so hard to say no to people and to say no to the demands that are put on us? You know, I'm going to take you back to my first day of sabbatical. This is Sunday the 11th of June. And I have to tell you that I thought that, in my mind, I imagined it that night I was going to be walking on the clouds. I thought for sure you'd have to, I'd be floating around. I'd be giddy with excitement. I thought that first Monday I would be just bouncing off the walls. You know what I found instead? I found that I was really anxious, really edgy, really tense. And so I started to think through that, try to figure out what's going on. And I realized a couple things were happening. Here's the first thing. Rob Tornster believed that Sunny Slope Church depended on him. I got swept up in this idea that the health and the success of Christ's church somehow had to do with me. And now I'm gone. Now I'm away. What's going to happen in 3 months? I don't think I'm alone in that. I think one of the reasons that we often feel like we have to always be working and doing and productive is that because somehow we think the outcome and the results rest all with us. That it's up to us. It's up to what we do as parents. It's up to what we do as an employee. It's all on us. And God reminds us, when we read about creation, we read that God didn't just create the world, but He sustains it too. It's His world. It's His church. We're His people. I love how the Heidelberg Catechism talks about providence. Providence is the idea that the doctrine of teaching of God's care for creation. And in the Catechism it says that providence is the power and the presence of God by which He upholds heaven and earth and leaf and blade and every part of creation, and that all things come to us not by chance but from His fatherly hand. See, we can rest to the degree that we believe that. That we believe that God is sovereign. That we believe that He's in control. That the results rest with Him. They depend on Him. Your parenting, your work, sometimes have these delusions of grandeur, don't we? Trusting the providence of God says it's in God's hands. I got thinking one more thing. It felt weird for me on Monday not to have to get up at the usual time and get off to work and check the messages on the machine and check the emails and all that. It just felt weird. And I think that's because in some way I had that feeling that I am what I do. My identity was wrapped up in my work and my job. Maybe you feel that way too sometimes. I think that's sort of natural to human beings. We just define ourselves by our work, by what we do, by our parenting, by our service in the community, by our service in the church, by our whatever, by our degrees, by our promotions. We buy into that. And we have to learn over and over again that that's all really, those things are important. They have their place. But if we think that they define us, we're just buying into a facade. It's just a covering. You can get all the degrees in the world. You can have like 20 letters after your name, and it's still not going to feel like enough. You can get promoted top of the company. It's still not going to feel like enough. You can win athletic scholarships and win tournaments and win games, and you're still going to feel restless. Why? Because you aren't dealing with the real problem. The real problem of our hearts goes much deeper. It's our relationship with God that, left by ourselves, it's all out of whack. We're separated. We try to cover that. We try to deal with it in a whole lot of different ways. But it'll leave us restless. It'll leave us unsatisfied. Try to define ourselves by what we do. It'll never work. It's no small thing that the Bible actually uses rest as a metaphor or picture of what salvation really is. That's why Jesus says in Matthew 11, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will what? I will give you rest." He's not saying, come over to me and I'll give you a little time by yourself and you can just get caught up on sleep. He's saying more. He's saying, I'm going to give you the rest that you need. I'm going to give you the rest for your soul. Hebrews 4 picks up that same idea. Let us enter now into that rest. And what is it saying? It's saying, put your faith in Jesus. Look to Him and you will find the rest that you're after. See, you'll rest when you know, and to the degree that you know that Jesus came and He did all the work for you. He lived the life of perfection that you'll never live on your own. Try your whole life. You'll never measure up. Jesus already did it. He earned the approval of His Father. He lived the life so that when God looked down on Him and God said, this is my Son and I'm pleased with Him, He did the work. But you know what? His work was given to us. It's credited to us so that when God looks at us, He sees us through that lens of what Jesus has already done. So that, you know what, you can, boy, does that ever give you rest, because you can say, look, nothing I ever do or don't do is going to make me any more or any less in God's sight. You can say no to people, you're going to disappoint people, but you can do it in the assurance that I have God's approval. It's the only approval that matters. See, that's how you find rest. You can stop your work, you can take a day off, you can take a vacation, because you say, my work doesn't define me. I'm defined by my relationship with Jesus. Trust that and know that. That's what gives you rest. You know, they tell us that there's really two different kinds of sleep, right? If you go in for like a sleep study or whatever, you know, there's like the sleep when you first drift off and you're kind of light sleeper, and that's when you're easily woken, right? Just a little noise is all it takes to wake you. They tell us that if that's all the sleep that you're getting, you're not really resting. You sleep all night like that, and some of us do, and you know how tough it is. You wake up, you're like, I didn't even sleep. But you know what you really need? You need what they call REM sleep, right? Rapid eye movement. That's like where your whole, like probably 3/4 of your mind just shuts down. You're out of it. That's when your body is resting. The rest that we're called to take, build it into the rhythm of our lives, is the rest that points us to that REM sleep, that sleep for the soul, that deep, satisfying assurance says we belong to Jesus. So are you resting?